reputation for being a polity wonk. And if you don't know, a wonk is someone who really enjoys something and has a lot of information about it. In this case, it was Presbyterian polity, which is the way our denomination structures its common life. Okay, true confessions, I am not a polity expert, as Jack Danner can tell you. I do not feel like an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I have to reference the instruction manual a whole lot, and this summer, when I got to experience moderating session meetings, I was ushered into uncharted territory for me. But one of the guiding principles that has stuck with me is that as Presbyterians, we like to do things decently and in order. As a funny side note, this summer at the Montreat Youth Conference, the two community life coordinators that were on staff that week were jokingly nicknamed Decency and Order because they helped to make sure that that's what was maintained. And I love being in spaces where those dorky jokes are understood. But the point I'm trying to make is that our little limb of the Christianity tree likes to have things make sense and have a pattern and have a purpose. And that kind of stands to reason since we trace our spiritual lineage to lawyers and scholars. And when things start to get out of order, sometimes we get a little bit bent out of shape, and I'm sure none of us can relate to that. As much as we like to joke about how slow to change we can be, there's also some truth to it. And liking things to be done deliberately and thoughtfully isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, God created order out of chaos. We weren't made to live in constant chaos and upheaval. And yet, sometimes we take this too far. And it's not only an issue for Presbyterians or even just for Christians. Take just about any community you can think of, and you will see that they tend to be able to sort of have a magnetic pull toward maintaining the status quo, for keeping things the way that they are. And whether it's about how things are done or who is involved, we often find comfort in the familiar, and so we go into protection mode. Harry Adams writes that there are risks in a strong community. There is a constant tension between being inclusive and being exclusive, with serious questions to be faced. Questions like, what is right? Who is worthy? How do we ensure a future for our community? And none of these questions are new. They are questions that the church has been asking since before it was the church. Even among Jesus' disciples, and even among the ancient Israelites, these questions loomed. In Numbers, we read about Joshua's concerned response when 2 men were prophesying in the camp instead of with the other 68 elders who had gathered at the tent of meeting outside the camp to receive the power to prophesy and lead. These 2 didn't follow instructions, so how could they be right? And in Mark's gospel, we read about John. And at least in this story, I sort of think about John as like the parliamentarian of the bunch. Hey, Jesus, I don't know if you've heard, but there's this guy running around casting out demons using your name, but he isn't with us. Don't worry, though. We got it. We took care of it. We told him to cut it out. Things were not being done in the right way or by the right people. Jesus was the one with the power to cast out demons, and he had shared that with the 12. And this exorcist wasn't in their number. So surely Jesus would be proud and grateful to John for his defense of Jesus' honor and their new community. After all, we all know that plagiarism is wrong. But, surprise, or maybe not if you read enough of the Gospels, Jesus tells John to cut it out. Don't make that guy stop. If he is able to cast out demons in my name, then he's tapped into the Holy Spirit and is on the right side of things. Let's take the help where we can find it. Now, we may not really be surprised by Jesus' response, but Jesus was possibly surprised and disappointed that his closest disciples still seemed to not be getting it. Jesus doesn't just quickly say that it's okay for that guy to do some healing. Jesus instead uses a lot of tools to try teaching, again, tools like proverbs and exaggerated imagery, and even some shock value. So to understand this somewhat oddly constructed lesson, I think it's important that we look a little bit at the wider context. Now, John is one of the 3 disciples who witnessed Jesus' transfiguration, that what my friend calls shiny, happy Jesus moment, where they heard the voice say, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." Those 3 had witnessed a special revelation of Jesus' glory and then had followed him throughout Galilee. Jesus had spent time teaching them in particular and countering their arguments about who among them was the best. Jesus had taught them already that if someone wanted to be greatest, they needed to be the least. He even had a child come to him, and he took them in his arms and said that greatness in discipleship looked like serving and looked like welcoming children, those who were thought to have no power but who trusted. But then, almost cutting Jesus off, is John, acting like he hadn't been listening to a word. Instead, he was still trying to figure out who was more powerful, the disciples or this exorcist. The problem that John presents is not that the man was not following Jesus, but that he was not following the 12, as Lamar Williamson put it. One of my friends and fellow pastor, Ben Masters, calls this statement of John's a Freudian slip, and I think that's sort of correct. Because it gives away that John's concern at that moment was not about welcoming the little ones or serving others, but on who is in and who is out, who has access to Jesus' power and who does not. And this slip does not escape Jesus' notice, and he calls John out on it with direct rebuke and forceful teaching. After stating that anyone who is doing deeds of power or miracles in his name is someone to be accepted, Jesus issues a stern warning. Now, I find it hard to imagine Jesus sitting with a child on his lap talking about being thrown into the sea with a millstone around one's neck or dismembering oneself, but that seems to be what's happening. I had a hard time reading it when there's children around. But perhaps Jesus chooses that moment when he might be expected to speak tenderly and carefully to drive home his earlier point about the importance of the little one in their midst. He calls John and the other disciples to task, asking them to take a good, hard look at how they are behaving, at their current way of following him. Was their behavior making it easier or harder for children or for believers outside of that circle to discover their own path of discipleship? When Jesus warns that it is better to drown or to lose a limb than to cause another to stumble, the verb that Jesus uses for stumble is not as gentle as it might seem if we just think about tripping just a bit and stumbling forward. Sharon Ring notes that the sense of the verb is of being so horrified that one simply cannot remain in the place or go forward along the path where one had that experience. It's the Greek verb from which we get our English word scandalize. It's a big thing. To be a stumbling block or to put a stumbling block before someone is not simply to trip someone up. It is to deter them. It is to cause them to turn and run in the opposite direction. It has long-lasting consequences that are larger than a scraped knee from a little fall. Jesus talks about those consequences for the one who causes the stumbling or falling away in terms that seem maybe strange to us, but that the disciples would have recognized. This was not the first time that they would have heard about unquenchable fire and worms that don't die, which, frankly, the worms not dying sounds the most terrifying to me. It's imagery that comes from the Hebrew scriptures, and they were linked in Jewish consciousness to punishment and to torment. Jesus might not have been talking about literal fires, but the hyperbole, the exaggeration, helps to emphasize the seriousness of causing uncalled for hindrances to other people. One scholar notes that the body metaphor that Jesus used here might have been referring to a communal body, not just an individual body, which is normally how I had read this passage. similar to what Paul does in his letters to the Corinthians. Rather than only referring to individual sins that might harm one's own walk with Christ, although that is an area to be considered, Jesus might also be talking about parts of communities, like rules about who can perform exorcisms and who can't, that in the end hurt the whole body. While amputation is painful, letting something harmful fester can be even worse. One of my New Testament professors, Dr. Clifton Black, wrote that if one suffering gangrene, whether of body or soul, pretends to be healthy, the outcome is hell. What if that's the kind of hell that Jesus is talking about? In using this drastic speech, Jesus doesn't just let John off the hook with a simple correction, but calls John and the other disciples and us to take notice of the things inside of ourselves and inside of our communities that may be causing others to turn and run the other direction, away from the bread of life. Perhaps the decency and order sought by this early band of disciples was getting in the way. I kind of want to wonder and imagine what happened to that unnamed exorcist. Did he continue to help people despite being told off by Jesus' disciples? Did he continue to walk the path of discipleship, or did he turn away? The actions of Jesus' followers have consequences, and we see it today, too. In a 2017 survey, 66% of Americans between the ages of 23 and 30 reported that they had stopped attending church regularly for at least a year. And a recent USA Today opinion piece cites that survey and reports that one of the top responses given, and I'll quote this, was that church members seemed divisive, judgmental, or hypocritical. One of my friends has told me that they made the decision to stop attending church and informed their parents of that decision when they were a child, when they saw examples of the disconnect between what was taught and how they saw people living. And for all that we might hear in some circles about ex-evangelicals, a term for those who have left more conservative Christian traditions for mainline denominations or for no denomination at all, this is not just a problem for the Catholic Church or for conservative Christianity. We can all fall into the trap of being convinced that we have it right and that we get a say in how God works and in who God works. But Jesus tells us that when we find ourselves acting in those ways that keep other people from following too, we need to take corrective action. Like Moses replied to Joshua in Numbers, I imagine Jesus saying, "Would that all the Lord's people were prophets." Because God's plans are big, they're expansive. God's desire to reconcile all creation has room enough for everyone to be involved. Masters writes about the strange end of this passage, saying that by linking fire with salt, whose source domain includes cooking, food preservation, and disinfecting, Jesus speaks about God's redemptive power. God's ultimate intentions are oriented toward restoring creation's goodness rather than penalizing its brokenness. As a community of Jesus followers, sometimes we need to be purified, even by fire, to reflect this expansive love. This whole passage, disjointed though it might seem, from its conversation about unknown exorcist to its strange talk of being salted with fire, it all carries a message for communities that claim to follow Jesus. Sometimes, rather than keeping the church correct, we end up becoming stumbling blocks when we get too concerned over who is worthy. Jesus shows us who we are to welcome: the little ones, the ones others overlook, the ones that don't seem to hold any power or aren't part of the in crowd, the outcasts, the refugees, the marginalized. There is no place for an in crowd in God's kingdom because everyone is welcomed. And the passage doesn't only contain a warning for us, but also good news. Jesus gives John and the disciples another chance to learn. And so it is with us. That we must be like Jesus is not good news, Williamson notes. On that score, disciples always fail. The good news is rather that, despite our failure, Jesus constantly renews the call to follow him. Because Jesus welcomes all, we are also welcomed, flaws and all. If we can set aside being so worried about our own status or influence, we will learn from our neighbors, perhaps especially those we might think of as little ones, just how wide God's love is. After all, no one is insignificant to God. The beauty of God's work and the expansiveness of God's reach are gifts for us to receive as we open our arms to receive all whom Christ calls. Thanks be to God for that great gift. Amen.